Now let's talk about training intensity for powerlifting, specifically individualizing the training intensity for each single powerlifter. Now, if you get programming intensity right for the athlete, you'll get good progress and even break personal bests. But you get the training intensity wrong, you may find yourself plateauing, drop in performance, or even worse, get injured. So in this video, I want to go through everything that you need to know about training intensity, about how to best figure out the right intensity for each individual, including percentage and RPE, and how to adjust intensity around different scenarios. Now, without any further ado, let us begin. So what is intensity and what is it not? Okay, before we get into a deep dive into the best training intensity for powerlifting, we need to first clarify what we even mean by intensity. Now, when we talk about training intensity, we can be talking about two things: absolute intensity or relative intensity. Absolute intensity is essentially what percentage you are training at relative to your maximal strength, i.e. percentage of a 1 rep max. Now, relative intensity is about how hard a set is for the reps at that load that was performed, i.e. proximity to failure, which can be measured in RPE or RIR. So are absolute and relative intensity connected? Well, yes, they are interlinked, but they're not the same. Now, this chart shows the equivalent percentage of a 1 rep max that you are working towards if you are performing a certain rep range in a certain RPE. So let us take a heavy set of 4 at RPE 9. The equivalent percentage of a 1 rep max is about 86.3%, let's say. The absolute intensity is 86.3%. The relative intensity is about RPE 9. Now, if you take another example of a 1 rep set at RPE 7, the equivalent percentage of a 1 rep max is 89.2%. The absolute intensity is 89.2%. The relative intensity is about RPE 7. So in comparison to the first scenario, the absolute intensity is higher, but the relative intensity is lower. Now, before I show you how I go about working out the best intensities individualized for each powerlifter, let me go through some very important concepts that you really need to know first. The first one is that everyone will have a very individual response to intensity regardless of the training experience. This is interpersonal individual differences, i.e. how one person differs from another. The second one is that what people respond well to over time will change due to the nature of progressive overload, as well as other changing circumstances. This is intrapersonal individual differences, i.e. how someone differs from themselves over time. Individualized intensity for each lifter will be an essential part to getting you towards optimal training. A recent popular idea is about figuring out how to develop your perfect training week or training block, or the golden microcycle. A quote that I really like from Danny Lee is, "The golden microcycle is the perfect blend of exercise selection, volume, intensity, and frequency laid out in the most effective manner possible for the individual that will yield the greatest amount of progress in a given period of time." Now, for the goal of reaching optimal performance, this is an important art of programming that coaches should master. So how does optimal intensity change and differ between people? Now, a research paper that I really like to refer back to is this paper from Peterson in 2005 titled "The Applications of the Dose Response for Muscular Strength Development, a Review of Meta-Analytic Efficacy and Reliability for Designing Training Prescription." Now, this paper does a really good job at illustrating how individuals from different experience levels seem to differ in their response to variables for developing maximal strength. And if you look at this particular graph, you can see 3 distinct curves of response to intensities across 3 different populations: untrained, recreationally trained, as well as athlete population. And the conclusions that I personally draw from this are that, first of all, there is a dose response curve to training intensity. Second of all, as someone gets more experience, their optimal intensity exposure can change. And the third is that as someone gets more experience, there is a slowing down of progress. Now, what other factors influence optimal intensity for performance progress? Now, there are situations where you are not in a position to focus on finding your optimal intensity for strength performance, where your attention is more on other aspects. But in another sense, you are still optimizing intensity for that present situation. Here are a few examples: injury, technique change, lifestyle disturbances, introducing new variations, and a mental break from performance. So let's go through the first scenario of injury time. So when it comes to injury, it's not so much that intensity doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but the attention that you need to pay is how well the injury is managed over the sessions and the weeks. And a manipulation of volume and intensity will most likely occur iteratively. As a coach, what I really want to focus on when managing intensity during an injury is how much intensity can I just about reduce in training so that you can just start to recover, but not so much that the adaptations just get aggressively lost. The second one is technique change. right? So there may be scenarios when a lifter is due some technique changes, whether it's long overdue or whether it's an experimental technique change. In a situation like this, what's most sensible is building the stimulus from a much lower intensity to what the lifter is already used to. So the lifter, whoever it is, can have a safer approach to repatterning their technique. Changing technique in a movement is almost equivalent to performing a different exercise sometimes. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are immediately weaker, but you do want to gradually expose the lifter so as not to risk injury, as you may suddenly train through different muscle lengths somewhere. So with regard to intensity, you may want to drip feed some of the current training volume from the previous technique to the new technique. And this may start from changing the technique in the warm-up sets and gradually building onto the working sets. The next one is lifestyle disturbances. Now, most powerlifters are not going to be full-time athletes, and so it is no surprise that sometimes there are going to be things outside of the gym that will interfere with the flow of training. Now, whether it's a personal event or becoming a parent, getting a new job, going on holiday, so on and so forth. When you are in these situations, what you can recover from and make adaptations to can change. If life is chaotic, causing training to be inconsistent, it's hard to predict what the optimal dose of training is over that medium term. So the best thing that you can do from a programming standpoint is to maintain some form of realistic intensity and stimulus that can fit in with the lifter even on bad weeks. The next one is going to be introducing new variations. Now, introducing new variations is similar to the situation of changing technique. There's going to be a short-term learning curve with the new movement pattern, and the body is likely not necessarily adapted to this new movement pattern. And so for this situation, you are very likely to going to want to start from a level of intensity that is lower than your current average intensity. For example, let's say you are introducing pause squats, especially for someone who doesn't hit depth consistently. That extra time under tension in the bottom position of the squat may be a much more stressful stimulus and intensity for that lifter. And so you may need to titrate upwards in intensity from a lower intensity so that the athlete can adapt to it. The next one is going to be a mental break from performance. When it comes to getting the greatest success from a lifter, it's also going to lie on a path of staying in the game as long as possible. And sometimes when you've worked with an athlete for many years, taking a mental break from performance optimized training is going to help keep the lifter in the sport as long as possible. There are high-level lifters out there who occasionally spend a year out from competing just to keep their mind fresh before they get back into it again. Now, how does the best percentage change over time? According to the previously cited paper, it does seem like potentially that the average intensity that's optimal increases as they get more experienced. This is likely going to be related to the nature of long-term progressive overload and the fact that specificity will probably need to be higher long-term. It's also worth noting that this paper does include population from the athlete population. But in the real world, as lifters move into different phases of life where training is no longer the biggest stressor, or when lifters gain in body weight or go past a certain age, the optimal intensity may not necessarily keep on increasing through the years. Anecdotally, there seems to be an observation that I've made where average intensity that athletes can recover from seems to be less with age past a certain point. So when it comes to finding out the intensity, do you determine percentage intensity or RPE first? So we have absolute intensity and we have relative intensity. What do you have to figure out first? In my opinion, I like to determine the absolute intensity first, because relative intensity is more of a strategy of how we distribute the exposure of the absolute intensity, and is slightly more of a strategy of short-term fatigue management. Once you've figured out what absolute intensity you want to set, you can then decide on the spread of those reps per set with the constraints of the RPE. So let's figure out what the best intensity for beginners are. Before we discuss figuring out the best intensity for beginners, we are going to break this down into two types of beginners. There are going to be untrained lifters who have never lifted weights before, but then there are beginners who have familiarity with resistance training, but not necessarily powerlifting. Now, an untrained lifter who has never lifted before shouldn't need to focus too much on what their best intensity is, as their primary focus should be to be introduced to the sport, build technique, and develop good training practice. Now, depending on who that is, it might start with just with an empty bar. Now, once they pass that stage of good enough technique, and when they can hop on a more structured program, the best intensity for beginners is generally going to be low. Now, going back to the paper mentioned before, it does look like what untrained lifters should be exposed to, at least initially, should be somewhere around the 60% range. For most people with most exercises, this is generally going to be anywhere between a 15 to 20 rep max weight. In practice, you're not likely going to give them a set where they reach 15 reps at their 15 rep max. So their RPE might not even be anywhere close to a measurable amount initially. So the RPE may be way less than even RPE 5. Basically, so light that you cannot tell what the RPE is. This is probably what intensity should be like during the first month or two of starting powerlifting training. This is simply because for newer lifters, their priority should be focused on reinforcing that good technique and moving loads where they can focus a bit more on motor control and coordination, and less so on just force output. As most beginners will benefit from linear progression, they may stick to their original rep ranges, which is likely going to be anywhere from 5 to even 10 reps, and progress very gradually with their RPE over the next few months before they become an intermediate lifter. In a beginner's first year of training, the average intensity can very well start from around 60% to anywhere about 65 to even 70%. Now, beginners are unlikely to have 1 rep maxes, nor should they necessarily test it very early on. Those percentages are really just estimates. Also, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't expose a lifter to some sets with slightly higher intensities at all. This all depends on your subjective perception of the lifter's readiness as a coach. Now, a useful tip to really see what they will benefit the most is to gradually expose the lifter to more and more intensity from block to block and see which one lends to producing the fastest rate of progress. For example, for the first block of a chosen length of a certain number of weeks, exposing the lifter to an average intensity of about 60%, then on the next block, exposing the lifter to an average intensity of about 65%, then on the block after that, exposing the lifter to an average of about 70%. Now, let's talk about the best intensity for experienced lifters. So when it comes to finding the best intensity for experienced lifters, it's useful to look at the equivalent absolute intensity that has worked best for these lifters in their training history. So to make our decision on figuring out the best intensity that an individual lifter should benefit from, we can draw evidence and clues from the research literature, from the lifter's training history, and your own coaching experience with similar profile lifters. Drawing from these 3 domains forms an evidence-based approach to prescribing training programming. Another thing to remember is that evidence from research is generally based on averages of a population. So it might be a good place to start, but it's important to have a thorough process of individualizing the intensity. The previous paper that I mentioned earlier on suggested that recreationally trained and athlete populations should be exposed to intensities around 80 to 85% region, respectively. Obviously, these are based on averages, so assume that there is going to be a range around those percentages that people respond best to of this population category. When it comes to looking at absolute intensity, there isn't this one thing called absolute intensity that we look at. To get a good snapshot of one's training, we can break things down into the 3 aspects of absolute intensity: average intensity, peak intensity, and the spread of intensity. So average intensity deals with the average intensity across all reps performed. The peak intensity is the highest exposure of intensity that a lifter has been exposed to, and the spread of intensity refers to where the intensities are spread across the percentage range. A very useful way I like to categorize reps when looking at the spread of intensity is labeling them in zones. So for example, anything from 90% to 100% can be referred to as zone 1, anything from 80 to 90% can be referred to as zone 2, anything from 70% to 80% can be referred to as zone 3, and so on and so forth. Now, using my program analyzer, link in the description box below, you can then look at across training programs that the lifter has done before and reflects upon which programs produce the best progress. One thing that's worth noting is how long ago these programs were. What you can do is draw a table with one column detailing which program or training block this was, what the average intensity is for each program in the second column, and in the third column, how long ago this program was. You can then draw a graph and plot these average intensities of each training block or program against the progress of the E1RM on the y-axis. Now, you can measure progress in the percentage increase of strength per week. Now, progress in load improved per week and progress in percentage increase per week are going to be different, but you can look at both to see. For example, an increase from 150 kilos to 160 kilos compared to an increase from 180 kilos to 190 kilos in the same length of duration are both a 10 kilo increase, but the percentage increase is going to be higher in the former scenario. But another thing that's also worth noting is that the stronger you get, the slower that your progress is going to be anyways. In my opinion, percentage increase is going to be more useful while taking into consideration of when they were done. So plot these programs or training blocks on a table and graph it to visually see any patterns. It's important to note that this process is useful if you have exposure to a diverse set of programs. So someone who has program hopped a lot or has tried a lot of different programs is going to be able to offer a lot of data. So 4 types of patterns that you might see when you look at progress plotted against average intensity. The patterns that you may find will look like the following types. So you might get a type 1 response where there shows a positive relationship between the average intensity and progress. You might get a type 2 response where it shows an inverse relationship between the average intensity and progress. You might also get a type 3 response, which is more of a bell curve. So it shows a potentially optimal dose between the higher end and lower end of average intensity that you've been exposed to. Or you might get a type 4 response where the graph is a bit more scattered and it doesn't show an obvious relationship between average intensity and progress. If you get a type 1 response, this means you are likely to benefit from a higher end of intensity that you've been exposed to before, with even a chance of potentially benefiting from even more. If you have a type 2 response, this means you are likely to benefit from a lower end of average intensity that you've done before, with a chance of potentially benefiting from even less. If you've got a type 3 response, i.e. you've got a bell curve, this means you are likely to benefit from more moderate levels of average intensity that you've been exposed to before. If this is the situation, there may be more certainty with where your optimal dose is going to lie. If you have a type 4 response, this may require you to look into the nature of other training variables into the specifics, so you get a bit more context of the programs that were done before. But there's also another caveat here. So if you look at what you've done before and the average intensity that you've been exposed to, it's no guarantee that this will necessarily remain to be optimal for you in the present moment. And at the end of the day, you do need to look at average intensity in the context of everything else as well. So ultimately, you can then create your own hypothesis of what sort of average intensity you think that the lifter should be exposed to moving forward. If it's not clear what the average intensity that a lifter should be exposed to from the previous training data, you can then start to consider the spread of intensities across all of the reps. So for example, looking at whether all the reps are bundled in a very close range of intensities or whether they're spread really far apart. But what if you don't have reliable training history? Now, with regards to training data, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not obvious from historical training data. If the lifter has not been able to produce consistent, reliable training data for whatever reason, you can then go through a process of programming that specifically aims to see what the lifter responds better to. If you are not sure what level of average intensity to start off, you can then go through a process of programming that specifically aims to see what the lifter responds better to. If you're not sure what level of average intensity to start a lifter off, you can always start the lifter off with the lower end of intensity that the lifter has been exposed to and gradually drip feed intensity one block after the other to create data that you can respond to as a coach. So for example, one block, you keep the average intensity around, let's say 70%. Then the next block, you can keep the average intensity around, let's say 75%. And then the next block, you can then expose the lifter to an average intensity of about 80%, and so on and so forth, or however you want to experiment with the percentages. And through analyzing how well the athlete progresses through each block, you can then start to really hone in where the sweet spot is for intensity. It's also worth remembering that training intensity is not the only variable that you want to manage, but when it comes to managing metrics, it's worth managing one variable at a time. It's important to communicate these processes to the lifter well, so that they can set the best chances of adherence to the process as much as possible. Because if the lifter deviates too much from the program, you're not going to have reliable data that you can respond well to as a coach. And important considerations. So figuring out where intensity should lie is an important aspect of a larger process when designing effective powerlifting training programs. At the end of the day, you do need to see how intensity fits in with the larger picture of how training sessions influence each other and how training weeks influence subsequent training weeks. And this is a key part of working out a program that is truly individualized to that lifter. So I hope you guys really found this video useful. If you really like this sort of content and you want to see more of this sort of programming content, please comment in the box below. And if you really found it useful, please subscribe to the channel as it helps the channel loads. And I will see you guys on the next one.